Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Today, we will tackle about the developments in stylistics. This unit looks at some point of the important influence in stylistics that have helped shape its development over the years. From the classical periods onwards, there has been continued healthy interest among scholars in the relationship between partners of language in a text and the way a text communicates. The Greek rhetoricians, for example, were particularly interested in the troops and devices that were used by orators for effective argument and persuasion, and there is indeed a case for saying that some stylistic work is very much a latter-day embodiment of traditional rhetoric. However, there is one particular field of academic inquiry from the early 20th century that has had a more direct and lasting impact on the methods of contemporary stylistics. This field straddles two interrelated movements in linguistics, known as Russian formalism and Park School structuralism. Of the former movement, key figures include Viktor Skovsky and Boris Tobovsky. Of the latter, John Moversky and William Matthews. One scholar whose work literally links both movements is Roman Jacobson, who moved from the Moscow circle of the Pargio group in 1920. Many of the central ideas of these two schools find their reflexes in contemporary stylistics, and two of the more durable theoretical contributions are the focus of this unit. These are the concept of foregrounding and the notion of the poetic function in language. And right now, we will proceed to foregrounding. Foregrounding refers to a form of textual patterning which is motivated specifically for literal aesthetic purposes. Capable of working at any level of language, foregrounding typically involves a stylistic distortion of some sort, either through an aspect of the text which deviates from a linguistic norm, or alternatively, where an aspect of the text is brought to the fore through repetition or parallelism. That means that foregrounding comes in two main guises: foregrounding as deviation from a norm and foregrounding as a more of the same. Foregrounding is essentially a technique for making strange in language, or to extrapolate from Shovsky Russian term Australiani method, a method of defamiliarization in textual composition. Whether the foregrounded pattern deviates from a norm or whether it replicates the pattern through parallelism, the point of foregrounding as a stylistic strategy is that it should acquire salience in the act of drawing attention to itself. Furthermore, this salience is motivated purely by literary considerations, and as such constitutes an important textual strategy for the development of images, themes, and characters, and for stimulating both effect and effect in a text interpretation. Well, foregrounding is not therefore the simple byproduct of this or that writer's idiosyncratic predilections in style. For example, in Jonathan Swift, a writer with much to say about language and style, was repeatedly never ever very fond of words which were made up for only one syllable. Whereas the relative scarcity of monosyllabic words in Swift's work might therefore be noticeable or silent. It is rather more a consequence of the personal stylistic foibles of the writer than a carefully modulated design in literally foregrounding. So, the theory of foregrounding raises many issues to do with stylistic analysis of text, the most important of which is probably its reliance on the concept of a norm in language. Given the functional diversity of language, it is very difficult, if not impossible, to say what exactly a normal sentence in English actually is. This constitutes a substantial challenge to foregrounding theory because the theory presuppose that there exists a notional linguistic yardstick against which a particular feature of style can be measured. A related issue concerns what happens when a once deviant pattern becomes established in a text. Does it stay foregrounded for the entire duration of the text, or does it gradually and troublesly slip into the ground. Well, one way of addressing these important questions is through a short illustration. Unit C8 of this book develops a workshop in a particular stylistic which is based on a passage from the Inner Semmes novella, The Old Man and the Sea in the year 1952. That passage arguably typifies Hemingway's written style, a style which literary critics have described with epithets like flat, dry, restrained, journalistic, or even tough guy. These observations are largely based on a perceived scarcity of adjectives in the writer's work, which is correlated with the machismo feels of much of his narrative style. It is indeed true that in the first few lines of the passage analyzed in C8, almost all of the nouns receive no adjectival modification at all. The tuna, the stern, the gaff, the line, and the fish. Let us accept for the moment then that this marked non-adjectival adjectivical pattern is foregrounded because it deviates from our expectation about the normal style of the 20th century post-fiction. And right now, let us proceed to Jacobson's poetic function. In a famous paper that still reverberates in much of today's stylistic scholarship, the structuralist poetician Roman Jacobson proposes a model of language which comprises 6 key functions. These are the conative, phatic, referential, emotive, poetic, and metalingual functions of language. Alongside the referential function, the content-carrying component of a message, and the emotive function, the expression of attitude through a message, there is one function that stands out in respect of its particular appeal to stylicians. This is the poetic function, which Jacobson defines thus: the poetic function projects the principle of equivalence from the axis of selection into the axis of combination. This rather terse formula is not the most transparent definition you are likely to come across in this book. So, some unpacking is in order. As a short demonstration of the formula at work, consider first of all following example, which is the opening line of W. H. Auden's elegiac poem in memory of W. B. Yeats in 1939. A key verb in the line has been removed, and you might wish to consider what sort of word would make an appropriate entry. Let's say, for example, in he blank in the dead of winter. So what would be the appropriate word on the blank there? So there are clearly many items that might go into the slot vacated in the line. That said, some words, if semantically compatible, can be ruled out on the grounds of inappropriateness of the context, the euphemistic cliche, passed away, or the crudely informal idiom kick the bucket are unlikely to be strong contenders in the context of a poetic elegy. You may instead prefer to settle on a verb like died, a contextual neutral form which is more in keeping with the poem's obvious funeral theme. However, the missing verb is actually disappeared. Instead here for clarity. So he disappeared in the dead of winter. Or yes, that's it. The technique of blanking out a word in a line, a closed test in stylistics parlance, is to force us to think about the pool of possible lexical entries from which a choice is ultimately made. This pool of available words is what Jacobson means by his term access of selection. What is significant about Auden's selection? One word taken from many possibilities is that it injures a series of renouncements across the line as a whole. Notice, for example, how the 3-syllable word disappeared creates associative phonetic links with other words in the line. Most obviously, its initial final consonant is D, alternates with those in the same position in the word dead later in the line. Possibly more subtly, its stressed syllable is disappeared, contains a diphthong, the first element of which is the vowel I, the same as the vowel in he. This type of vowel harmony, known as assonance, further consolidates points of equivalence across the poetic line. However, there are also semantic as well as phonetic transferees in this line. Notice how it is the season, winter, which takes over the semantic quality of death, and when positioned together in the same grammatical environment, the words dead and disappeared enable new types of significant to emerge. So, in summary of this topic is that it is important to footnote the foregoing discussion with a rider, whereas many of the precepts of both the formalist and Parg school movements have had a significant bearing on the way stylistics has developed. Well, this is not for a moment to say that stylicians have embraced these ideas unequivocally, unanimously, or without debate. We have already touched upon some of the theoretical problems associated with theory of foregrounding, and in this context, stylicians like Van Peer in 1986 and Cook in 1994 have made advances in solidifying the foundations of this generally useful concept. Amongst other things, their work has incorporated cognitive and psychological models of analysis to explain how text processors perceive foregrounding in text. So, application of the concept of the poetic function in language also brings with it an important caveat. Although not articulated especially clearly by Jacobson, it is essential to view the poetic function not as an exclusive property of literature but rather as a more generally creative use of language than can pop up, as it were, in a range of discourse contexts. One consequence of seeing the poetic function as an exclusive literary device is that it tends to separate off literature from other uses of language, and this is not a desired outcome in stylistic analysis. This latter issue will come more to the fore in the text unit along this strand, C3, while the unit below provides an opportunity through the analysis of a short poem to investigate and illustrate further the concept of foregrounding. Now, let us proceed to levels of language at work. An example from poetry. So this unit or this chapter or this topic is that it investigates patterns of language and a single short text, forms a useful intersection between the two areas of interest raised in units B1 and A2. On the one hand, it offers a chance to illustrate some basic principles of foregrounding in the context of literary discourse. On the other, it develops further the main remit of this thread by exploring how different levels of language can be pressed into service in stylistically significant ways. These themes will be worked through jointly as the unit progress. So, one of the example of poem is that on E. Cummings, a love is more thicker than forget. The following entitled poem was published in 1939 by the American poet Cummings. You can read it on the PowerPoint show on the screen. Well, that poem or this text, a love poem of sorts, shall, in the absence of a formal title, be referred to from now on as a love is more thicker. It certainly bears many of the familiar stylistic imprints of its author, notable among which is the conspicuous feelings and orthography resulting from the removal of standard punctuation devices such as commas, full stops, and capital letters. It also contains a number of invented words, neologisms such as the adjectives sunly, moonly, as well as the verb onby, which suggests a kind of reversal in sense from being to not being. Perhaps even more markedly, this poem treats existing words in the English lexicon, especially adjectives and adverbs. So, in a striking and colorful way, in counterpoint to this more deviant and strand of textual structure, there is nonetheless a high degree of regularity in the way other aspects of the poem are crafted. Observe, for example, the almost mathematical symmetry of the synthesic organization where keywords and phrasal patterns are repeated across the four verses. Indeed, all of the poem's constituent clauses are connected grammatically to the very first word of the poem, love. And now let us proceed to choosing models for analysis. In order for a solid basis for interpretation to be built, we need to be both clear and precise about what resources of language Cummings uses. So the preceding rather informal description needs to give way to a more rigorous account of linguistic technique. To do this requires that we step back from the text for a moment in order to pinpoint more narrowly which aspects of language in particular the poet is manipulating. Adjectives, for a start, have already been highlighted as one of the main sites for stylistic experimentation in the poem. Constituting a major word class in the vocabulary of English, adjectives ascribe qualities of entities, objects, and concepts. Familiar examples of which are words are like large, bright, good, bad, difficult, and regular. A notable grammatical feature of adjectives and what which Cummings exploits which particular stylistic forms is their potential for gradability. Many English adjectives can be graded by extending or modifying the degree or intensity of the basic quality which they express. So, a useful test for checking whether or not an adjective is gradable is to see if the intensifying word very can go in front of it. Indeed, all of the adjectives cited thus far satisfies this test. A very bright light, the very good decision, this very regular routine, and so on. The test does not work for another group of adjectives, known as classifying adjectives, which specify more fixed qualities relative to the noun they describe. In the following examples, insertion of very in front of the classifying adjectives former and strategic feels odd. The very former manager, those very strategic weapons. A special feature of gradable adjectives whose significance to love is more thicker is shortly to become clear. Is their capacity to compare objects and concepts through expressions of comparative, superlative, equal, inferior relationships. Thus, a comparative form of the regular adjective large can be formed by adding the inflectional morpheme er to form larger, while a superlative form adds est to form largest. Comparative and superlative gradation of irregular adjectives involves a change in the whole stem of the word. Thus, good becomes respectively better and best. If, on the other hand, the adjective contains more than one syllable, then the comparative and superlative forms normally require the introduction of a separate word as a more regular or most difficult. Finally, adjectives may be graded to signal equal relationships as bright as difficult as well as inferior or negative as opposed to positive relations, less large, less least regular. So another notable feature of adjectives, again pertinent in the present context, is the way the grammar of English allows for material to be placed after the adjective in order to determine more narrowly its scope of preference. Compare for assistance the following sentence. Number one sentence is the pilot was conscious. Number two sentence is the pilot was conscious of his responsibilities. Clearly, very different meanings can be assigned to the adjective conscious in the two examples, whereas the adjective on its own in number one suggests mercifully a general state of being awake. In the second example, the append phrase targets more specifically a special kind of awareness on the part of the pilot. Thus, in a sentence like Mary is now much better at maths, the main adjective signaling Mary's general improvement is better is bounded on both sides by other elements. These elements comprise the intensifier much and the scope of defining element at maths. So notice here how to lose of this final scope element would invite a very different interpretation, or at least a much less specific interpretation for the clause as a whole. Now, let us proceed to another topic, exploring levels of language in love is more thicker. Let us return now to the coming text, and in particular to this manipulation of the features of grammar and vocabulary pinpointed above. To some extent, love is more thicker is an object lesson is how not to form adjective phrases in English. Much of what the poet does is arguably either grammatically redundant or semantically anomalous, not intended as a slight on the style of writing. This comment requires some explanation. For a start, Cummings constantly reduplicates the grammatical rules for comparative superlative gradation. And in spite of their one-syllable status, adjective like thick and thin receive both the inflectional morpheme and the separate intensifier more thicker. However, No sooner is this pattern introduced in the poem that it is shown, of course, by a number of secondary operations which constitute good examples of eternal foregrounding. So, these are by no means all of the lexical and grammatical operation Cummings employs, nor indeed are they even all of the tweaks performed on the structure of adjective phrases. The scope element introduced above as the device that rounds off the meaning of the adjective phrase also comes in for particular enhancement in the poem. Take first of all the conventional usage of the structure as embodied in the proverb, blood is thicker than water. Here, the comparative adjective thicker connects up the entity of blood with the key item in the scope element water. Moreover, so that the adjective can as it were do its job, the entities thus compared need to be compatible at least in some measure. Both blood and water are liquids. For example, it is their relative viscosity that forms the noun of the comparison. A comparison of love might therefore reasonably anticipate another noun element which derives from the broad compass of human emotion, yet nothing of the sort is offered by Cummings. Instead, it is verbs, of all things, which often feel the position reserved the compared entity. Consider the opening sequence of the poem in the context of the structural formula. Now, let us go to stylistic analysis and interpretation. It is admittedly not easy when faced with complex language like this to discuss either what a text means or indeed how a text means. However, it is important to stress that in spite of the veritable semantic labyrinth that is love is more thicker, the poem still does communicate. Indeed, a case could be made for arguing that it is the very opacity, the very indeterminacy of its linguistic structure which acts out and parallels the conceptualization of love that Cummings seeks to capture and portray. Right now, let us proceed to sentence styles, development, and illustration. This unit sets out to achieve two main goals. Focusing exclusively on grammar, it narrows down the broader perspective adopted in B2, which was principally interested in how various levels of language function in textual patterning. This unit or this topic also dovetails with other units in this strand both by offering a number of extensions to the model of grammar developed in A3 and by paving the way over the practical stylistic exercise that will be undertaken in C3. So let us talk about the sentence types. The principal focus of attention thus far in our study of grammar and style has been on the clause and on the units which are situated beneath in ought on the rank scale. So far, little attention has been paid to the highest unit of organization in grammar, the sentence, also known as the clause complex. The sentence is far from straightforward category. Grammarians are divided about importance, with some arguing that it's really only an extension of the clause and others that is comprised a genuine unit with its own elements of structure. Whatever is precise theoretically status, the sentence is nonetheless a significant feature in the organization of style and is worth the sentence is nonetheless a significant feature in the organization of style is worth elaborating upon in the title more detail here. The most simple type of sentence structure is where the sentence comprises just one independent clause. So, for example, is he ate his supper, he went to bed.